should we consider trees and plants like human beings? Because the common knowledge is that they talk to each other, they take care about each other, at least like big trees about their seedlings, and they are exchanging nutritions and warnings. So they show some kind of intelligence, don't they? Today we're speaking with Marc-André and Justine, because Justine wrote a paper together with the co-authors Jason and Melanie exactly about that. They did a deep dive into the literature, and now we know, is the forest talking? Are they exchanging information and nutrition? Are they warning each other? What is going on in the wood wide web? And I will promise you the answer will surprise you. So, Marc-André, what was going on in the past with the CMNs, the common mycorrhizal networks? Can you shine a little bit of light on it? How it was in the past? What was the common stigma about it? What did we think we know about them? And how was it for you?
In the very ancient past, when I was doing my PhD, it was nothing but maybe some experiment in the lab that showed that sometime a given mycelium was able to join two plants and maybe to do some exchanges. There was one important work in the 60s by Bjorkman who showed that a non-chlorophyllous plant, Monotropa hypophytis, was able to harvest carbon from trees by way of a shared mycorrhizal fungus. But it was at the beginning of the 90s, something that didn't exist. And at the end of the 90s, thanks to, for example, works by Susan Simard, it popped up that we cannot see the mycorrhizal association as a one-to-one, one fungus, one plant association, but rather as a network of plant associated with different fungi. We can say that, for example, a simple herbaceous plant has like 10 mycorrhizal fungi, a tree like 100 to 200 different species of mycorrhizal fungi on the roots. So the plants have different fungi. They link different fungi by way of their root system, and the fungi, they can colonize different plants from same or different species, and they link them. And so it started from the late 90s with this idea that in some case, there can be some nutrient exchange by way of the shared fungi, and that the story of Monotropa hypophytis was not a curious one. Just to finish with, over the years, there was more and more report that sometime exchange occur, and we shall come back on that. It's rather punctual labeling than full budget of what is exchanged over the year, and also some rather ex situ experiments showed that even some signals could be exchanged between plants. That's rather in the second decade of the 2000s. That's where we were. And honestly, there was a lot of excitement with that, to see the mycorrhizal association as a network and to try to look into how it's functionally active in ecosystems.
So maybe to make it clear for our listeners who have maybe never heard from CMNs, they are basically a network in the ground that connect every plant, like for example, let's take a forest, like a network of plants and fungi that connect below the ground or in the ground through a network, and it was thought that they can exchange and communicate in some way, right?
Exchange, yes. Communicate rather from ex situ experiments, but yes as well.
Okay, because that was also the thing why it was called WoodWideWeb, right? That it's all interlinked somehow, the forests.
Absolutely. And once again, it's not only the fact that plants are linked by the hyphae, the filaments, microscopic filaments of the fungi, but also the fact that those fungi are linked by plants. Let's not be too plant-centered here. It's really a network. And if you see it from the plant side, there is some evidence that, once again, food can be exchanged, nutrients can be exchanged, but also there could be also exchange of informations like warning against pathogens, like insects, fungi, or viruses.
And it all started, as you said, in the 60s, then late 80s, late 90s. There were more studies on that, and more the common picture of this I always call it the magic forest, who speaks to each other, grew, right?
Yeah, and there were two lines here. There was a lot of research on those networks, especially in my team, on plant on the storey from the forest ground connected to the trees and exploiting the carbon by way of this network. But there was also another line of the exchange between trees themselves. And this is this line that gave rise to a kind of myth that plants were helping each other. And I think it's the central point. At some point, behind the scientific facts, there was a trend in outreach, and then later I think it was invading science, to see the forest as a cooperation between trees, which, when you think of it, is a bit bizarre. Because when we are a tree next to another tree, you are in competition basically for light and resources from soil.
That makes a lot of sense, because, as you just said, in a forest, especially if you are a small tree, when you would be a big tree and see a small tree growing, you would be like a little bit concerned, like, is it going to be as big as I will be in the future and stealing light from me, or what is going on? So I would say there are two lines of thought I would have as a big tree, if I would be a big tree. Like, first would be he's an opponent, or the second one would be, if he's an offspring of mine, I need to help him grow. These two lines of thought I would have as a tree, and that was when I understood right or correct. That was what also was shown in some studies, or?
I perfectly see what you mean here. There is one exception to help other trees, is when it's increasing your fitness, your evolutionary value, and it's the case where you are helping your offsprings. And indeed, in this case, there is a rationale for that. But let's make a note that it's not so clear that this help, or that the phenomenon that we're investigated are related to kins. Actually, in terms of functioning of the network, what my team observed is plants from the orchids or Ericaceous family, which are living on the ground and which are just stealing carbon by way of the microbial fungus. So we found the cheaters. Whether there is a cooperation, and especially a cooperation when among kin, to be clear, this is, to my view, far from clear in the general case.
But the narrative still grew and grew. Also, with it even reached to Germany, so that someone that is not in a scientific field like I am read some papers, some news articles, where it was always called about the WoodWideWeb and how trees and plants and fungi are very special and maybe very, very intelligent, because they communicate, they warn each other, they exchange nutritions between each other, they help each other, and the stigma and the narrative grew with time, right?
Absolutely. It grew to a point which goes far beyond. Many of us had involved in outreach, as I am, had the feeling that sometime when they were replying to questions of people, they were facing a kind of poetic view of the system that was elaborated far beyond what the data we had at hand were showing. And once again, it was terrible, because people had stars in the eyes, looking at the forest as a big cooperation, as a love story between trees. And you were there with data that do not support that. We study, I repeat you, the cheaters on this system. That was a bit sad story at some point.
Yeah, so it grew so huge, the narrative, that it wasn't allowed anymore to question these studies to question that the plants are communicating between each other?
Well, that's where Justine is coming, by the way,
Yes.
because
Right.
the root. Come back to data.
Yeah, we with that question we build a perfect bridge to Justine.
Thank you.
because you wrote you and two colleagues of you wrote the paper Positive Citation Bias and Overinterpreted Results Lead to Misinformation on Common Mycorrhizal Networks in Forscht. I always love titles of papers. They are always on the point.
Yeah. I just wanted, so first I want to acknowledge my co-authors on that paper. That was Jason Huxema and Melanie Jones. I wanted to touch on a point that Marc-André, he mentioned sort of the history and the early view of CMNs in forests and the research that had taken place. So one of the papers that he mentioned was that paper by Samard et al. And actually my co-author, Melanie Jones, was involved in that research. And that came out. So that was the paper that showed that there was below ground transfer of a little bit of carbon between seedlings of different species. And at that time, they presumed it was through a mycorrhizal network. And I have to say, for me, I was a graduate student at the time, and that was the study that got me into mycorrhizal ecology. I just thought it was amazing. And I still do think it's a great paper. But yeah, just sort of going back and thinking about the history, that was definitely the study that got me into mycorrhizal ecology. But as Marc-André, as he mentioned through the years, and I think definitely in the past few years, we were also hearing extraordinary claims about mycorrhizal networks in forests. And initially, what got us thinking about this paper was not so much, we didn't come at it that we wanted to debunk myths or anything like that, but it was actually kind of more of an innocent, naive place in that we thought we must be missing some groundbreaking studies. We don't remember reading these studies that give evidence or give rise to some of these claims. And so we felt as scientists in the field that we should probably sit down and spend some time looking through the literature to figure out where did these claims come from, because some of them were extraordinary. And so
do you have an example?
So for example, this idea that large old trees can recognize their kin and send alarm calls to them through the mycorrhizal network in response to like drought or insect attacks. Or another one that we didn't touch on so much in the paper, but I hear a lot out there, is that this idea that old trees, as they're dying, they send all their carbon into the network, and then this flush of resources then directed to neighbors and kin. And these are extraordinary claims. And as Marc-André mentioned, this idea of trees protecting their kin, but we have to remember that there's fungi involved. So once those trees send their resources to the fungi involved in the symbiosis, it belongs to the fungi. So how they might be involved and why they care about sending it to the tree's kin is very kind of unclear. And Marc-André is right. We need to be thinking about the fungi. What are the fungi doing in this system? But anyway, so back to why we did the review. So as I mentioned, we were interested in, have we missed some studies? What's going on? We should get up to date. And that was really the catalyst in terms of, because again, we were hearing these extraordinary claims as well. And so that's what we did. So then the first thing, though, we wanted to understand what were the public saying about mycorrhizal networks in forests? Like, what was everybody talking about? What was everybody thinking about? And so the first thing we did is we sat down with the popular media. So we listened to a lot of podcasts. We watched a bunch of documentaries, read a bunch of books, watched TED Talks, all the same stuff that we thought everybody else had access to. And from that review of the popular media, we settled on what we called were 3 popular claims. So these were claims that we were hearing over and over and over again in the public. So the first one was this idea that common mycorrhizal networks are widespread in forests. The second one was that through these mycorrhizal networks, resources are transferred in a way that benefits seedlings. So tree seedlings plugging into the network grow and survive better than if they don't have access to a network. And then the third claim that has been getting a lot of traction recently, again, is this idea that big old trees can recognize their kin and send alarm calls to their kin through these mycorrhizal networks, and again, taken place in forests. So that's where we started. And then we simply sat down and just went through all the literature we could find on the topic. And we focused more on field studies in forests or woodlands or plantations, because this is where the public conversation seemed to be. It was what's happening in forests. But we did look at some results from lab studies too. And what we found is that, so for the first claim that common mycorrhizal networks are widespread in forests, and I want to be really clear that I think most of us, and Marc-André, we can talk about this, most of us think that trees are connected below ground through these mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are everywhere in the soil. Some of them are very generalist in terms of which tree species they'll colonize. So there's lots of reasons to believe that trees are connected below ground through these fungal networks. But when we were surveying the literature, we don't have, so let me back up. When you're trying to map these common mycorrhizal networks, once you start digging in the soil, you destroy the network. The hyphae are very small most of the time, smaller than roots. And so you can't dig around without destroying the network. So there's only a few studies out there, 5 actually, that map common mycorrhizal networks, and they're using indirect techniques. So they're genotyping roots, trees, and fungi, so we know which individual they belong to. But there's only 5 of these studies done worldwide. 4 of them are done in interior Douglas fir forests. 1 of them is done in a pine forest in Japan. So yes, we think that trees are connected below ground. There's lots of reasons to think that, but the actual nature of the network, how many trees are connected, which fungi are involved. Some fungi, the species, they just make small patches. Some of them might make bigger patches. Some of them have different kinds of structures that would be easier to connect at long distance, at small distances. So I think what we were saying, in a lot of the public's view is that there's this internet below ground, and there's like 1 or 2 fungi that are involved, and they're connecting all the trees in a forest. And we don't know. We don't know if that's what it looks like. But as Marc-André explained, there are many, many fungal species in the soil of forests. It's not just 1 or 2 species. There are many species, and they differ. They differ in their size. Some of them are very specific. They're not going to connect with all tree species. So even at the most basic level, we don't have a good idea of what these mycorrhizal networks look like. So that, yeah.
And if you, sorry for interrupting, but what I understood is, so far we haven't been able to see with our own eyes that there is a connection.
Well, no.
Right? Because they're so small and we can't dig them out.
Okay, so in the lab, as Marc-André explained, there's some very nice experiments where, say, 2 seedlings are growing together, and they're grown in between clear plates. So we can see the roots, and we can actually see the mycorrhizal fungi connecting the seedlings. So we can see it. And in the field, we did find one person, his name is Jim Trappy, where he actually went out and very, very carefully, he dug up the fungal hyphae and traced it back to different roots. But no one does that usually. It's very, very challenging work. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the fungi, they break. And so it's very hard in the field to directly see these connections. But definitely in the lab, yes, we know, we've seen them with our eyes that these can happen.
Okay, so basically we know they exist, but it's just very, very difficult to extract them in the nature.
Yes, it's hard. It's hard to know what they look like out in the forest. So then our next claim, this idea that resources are moved through the common mycorrhizal network and seedlings benefit. Well, when we looked at the studies, so again, we're focusing on field studies, it's not conclusive if those resources are moving through a common mycorrhizal network or if they're moving through solution in the soil. So they might be, but it's just not clear. And this other idea that seedlings benefit from being plugged into this mycorrhizal network, when we looked across the studies, across most studies, seedlings showed a neutral response to having access to these mycorrhizal networks. There's a small fraction of studies that showed that seedlings actually did worse when they had potential access to a mycorrhizal network. And then there's a small fraction of studies, I think 18%, where the seedlings, when they had access to these CMNs, they performed better and above root competition. So that part of the story that seedlings grow better all the time, plugged into the mycorrhizal network, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There's a lot that we still need to understand, but just that basic story is not holding up when we look at the field studies. And
there are studies that show all three sides. So they show that sometimes they benefit, sometimes they don't benefit at all. They suffer more, and sometimes it's neutral.
Most of the time.
And
yes.
If I may,
sorry, Marc-André, please jump in.
If I may insist here, I think that when you say we don't see the common mycorrhizal networks, it's fully true, and you expressed why. And I also buy fully the analysis you made on the forest, the tree issue of that. But also, one force of science is to see things that you can't see. That's how we do science. Yeah. And for me, my getting born into the networks as a researcher was after my PhD thesis. I was looking for a new field of research, and I started to investigate an orchid that grows in Eurasiatic forest, and especially in France, and which is not green. It's fully not green, fully heterotrophic, but when you dig out the roots, it's not parasitic on other plants. It's simply having mycorrhiza. That is, the roots of these orchids are associated with fungi, which so far were not identified, and they have no clear source of carbon. What I did at the time, it was early 2000s, was to investigate which fungus was there by DNA methods. And I found fungi from the Sebacina connection. And I found that, and I was doing my PhD in genotyping, which is the recognizing the genotype of fungi to allow to draw the extension of a mycelium or the fact that a fungus is shared between plants. And actually, I found that the same individuals were not only present on the root of the orchids, but also on the roots of the surrounding trees. So the network I found was a network of species shared by the trees surrounding the orchid and the orchid, but the Sebacina fungi are also found the same individuals on both sides. That's a genetic evidence, but as Justine and co-authors rightly point in their paper, it does not mean the fact it's the same individual, genetically speaking, doesn't mean that there is a true connection and that the hyphae, the filament of the fungi, are linking the two partners. Where the non-green orchid was great, it's because it was showing, first, when you cut the connections, it goes to death when you cut the soil between the tree and the orchid. But there can be many explanations to that. But also, you have a specific isotopic composition with rare form of carbon and nitrogen called carbon-13 and nitrogen-15, which are exactly those of the fungus. And later on, we were able to use this feature that the isotopic composition was different to show that some understory plants that are living in forest, they do have this isotopic composition showing that they harvest carbon from the fungus. Some are not chrophilous, like Monotropa hypopetis I noticed, or this orchid I studied, but some are green. And they mix photosynthesis with exploitation of the network. And I think we have here, with the isotopic feature on those plants, which are non-green or green, sometimes not so green, by the way, we have functional evidence that the network functions. But this does not mean that it is functioning in every case. And the strong point with isotopes is that we are able to build a budget and to say, okay, When I look at this plant, it's non-green, it's fully heterotrophic. All the food comes from the fungus. When I look at this one, it is green, and this percentage is coming from the fungus, and this percentage from its own photosynthesis, because once again of the isotopic composition. We have a budget. And what is often lacking when you have exchange between trees is that you see the exchange at some point, but you don't have a budget over the year. You don't know for how much this transfer is accounting for the carbon of the recipient, the donor, and you don't see.
I understand.
You don't see whether the trend you observed at a certain point is the mean, the general trend of transfer, because it can be reversed at some point. So I think that the budget question is very important.
So we know there are networks. We know that some plants need it more or need fungus more than others. And we know that there is some exchange between them. But what we don't know is basically a lot of the claims that were made in the past, like that
trees,
the parent trees are taking care about their seedlings, and that there is an exchange and that it's widespread over all of the forest and stuff like that. So how was it for you to find that out? Because as you said, Justine, you didn't start with the intention to debunk anything, but you start to like get on track again, like get the newest studies and the oldest studies into your brain again, kind of.
Yeah, it was how was it? To be honest, it was kind of sad. There was parts that I felt kind of sad. And I, looking back, I think what happened is that, so I think what you're hearing, Luca, is there is a lot of uncertainty and nuance and complexity that wasn't carried over. And instead, there was so much focus on that common mycorrhizal networks are always positive. Trees benefit. They have, and you've seen pictures where, again, it's this internet and there's resources traveling from one end to the forest to the other. And there are nuggets of truth to this. There are. It's not that it's all wrong or it's untrue, but it was just so exaggerated and overblown, and the uncertainty was not carried through at all. And just the extrapolation, like there are some very nice lab experiments done. One in particular that I think is very nice, that it shows that there is this signaling between plants through common mycorrhizal networks, but it's with a bean plant, and it's in a lab experiment, like a greenhouse. And so to take that outcome and then to say, and this is how a forest works, it's not appropriate. Like the systems are so different. And so there's so many steps in between from a lab experiment to what happens in an old growth forest that haven't been done yet. So we are just not there to be able to say, and this is how a forest works. And as Marc-André expressed, people love this story. Yeah, there's like stars in their eyes. Yeah. It's just, they love this story. It's almost like a quasi religion right now. And so now it's been really difficult to try to tamp it down and put the brakes on and say, we're not quite there yet. The story is way ahead of the science. And so I think, and even for myself, before I sat down and really worked with Melanie and Jason, where we very carefully reviewed the studies for what they said and what they didn't say. That's the other thing that I want to mention, is that when we worked on this study, is we were also tracking how those original papers, the results from those original papers, then were carried forward in subsequent papers. And what we found is that a lot of that nuance, or the caveats, the limitations that were often expressed in those original papers, they're not carried forward in the newer literature. And so it's not just the public that has become all starry-eyed about this story. It's scientists as well. And so we've showed that there is this bias towards citing papers or ideas that promote the idea that common mycorrhizal networks are beneficial, or that trees and seedlings benefit by being connected by mycorrhizal networks, and that all sorts of resources are being moved around. And that necessarily, it wasn't, those messages weren't always in those original papers. Like, they've been distorted over 25 years into something that is like a mischaracterization of common mycorrhizal networks in forests now.
Yeah. Marc-André, how was it for you when you found out, or when you heard about the paper from Justine and her colleagues? Were you also sad, or was it also kind of a maybe a relief feeling because the whole thing blew up so much?
Yes, because they were attacking the dragon for me, and I was probably not courageous enough to do it. I knew it was on the way because Jason Oxema, one of the co-authors, came for a short sabbatical in my lab in Paris before COVID, and we had time to discuss this. He made a nice seminary, so I knew there was something growing in the direction of a review paper to put the things in place. What I did not realize, to be honest, it was the level of miscitation Justine and co-workers are just pointing. It's amazing. They show that it's growing over the time, and it reaches, Justine, tell me if I'm wrong, up to half of the paper recently that are misciting the source.
So right now, today, half the papers coming out that cite those original papers are making unsupported statements.
And it came, it came to
sorry. Yeah.
Even I realized, and I learned, I was trying to look at that more closely. We described in some African forest that there was sharing between adults and young trees. And we looked based on isotopes, as I told you. If the carbon is going through the fungus, there is a change in isotopic content. We looked on the basis of that to see if the plantlets, if the seedlings that had same fungi as the adults, they received something, and the answer was no. And I can see now citation. I didn't realize that, Justine. And you're right. That there are some citation now that this paper is evidencing transfer.
Yes.
So I think here we see a very interesting link between science and society. It's not something separate. We can see that what society made of this information was influencing science. And what we see also with this nice paper is that you are doing, Justine, and with your co-workers, debunking, a kind of revealing another view, which is, well, probably less sexy, but more congruent to the evidence we have. So that allows more to handle the forest, to see the nature, to manage it. It's something that is probably more useful. But you're right. You remember me when you say that you killed something nice. A page of Darwin in his letters to colleagues, where he said that with his theory of competition and evolution by selection, he felt like revealing a murder he did. And this page is very interesting, but I think it's the heart of science. The heart of science is to tell us what is there, even if it kills our views and hopes, and especially if it does kill them, because then it gives us a step to more realistic and more serious handling and viewing of nature.
I agree with that. I think it's almost like the hypotheses that we love the most. Those are the ones that we should be the most skeptical of. Those are the ones
question the most.
Yes. And this was, I think, one of them, was this WoodWideWeb idea of the forest. Like I said, it's not just the public that loved it. I think scientists, we loved it as well. Yeah. It's a very appealing view of the forest. And looking back, because we loved it so much, we should have, we had to be very skeptical but it kind of missed scrutiny, and I don't really know why, but it's but I think it was time to happen. Yeah.
It was, yes. And probably we were too shy to do it before. Yeah. So it's nice to do it.
Well, and I think too, it's like you want to give space for different ideas. And you don't want to like step on someone's creativity. You want to give them space. But I think in this case, yes, maybe we were being a little bit too shy or just hesitant, or I know in my case, it took a long time. I just felt unsure. I just wasn't sure what the evidence was. And it's only when the three of us sat down and we spent months actually sitting in the papers and talking about them that I realized that the evidence is not so strong. It's not as strong as I thought. And it's kind of this thing, if you say something 1,000 times over, and if you hear it 1,000 times, I think it just starts to feel like it's a fact. And I think some of the WoodWideWeb stuff, as many of us, you hear it over and over and over again, that it was slipping into being a fact, when in fact it should have been, it needed to be scrutinized. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not the only area where this is happening. If you go to media news and the past and what's happening in humanity, as you need to repeat as a narrative just often enough, and it becomes like the common narrative, and everybody believes it without questioning it. And I think that is maybe what was happening a little bit here. And as you just pointed out, it's such a nice thing to believe, especially for the public. It's so, I mean, who would be opposed against a forest that is alive in a way that's intelligent, that's taking care about their children, so to say, and who's just this world, this wood wide web, and I mean, who would be opposed to this thought and this fact? So
that's the role of scientists, to offer a nice alternative view. And I think that one thing that will never be the same is that we know now that plants are not independent things. They are networked. They are also networked, by the way, by pollinators, because when one plant is feeding a pollinator, this pollinator will be used by another one. And I think that there is, and I also think this is overlooked scientifically speaking, what I will mention. I think that there is a major function of networks, which is the following. It's not the transfer of food or signal, but if plant A was growing a fungus with its huge mycelium, and then this mycelium is connected to plant B will have a mycelium that is prepaid. I think that this effect here needs to be considered with much more care. And there is actually a growing literature showing that the story I tell you doesn't work so much with the type of mycorrhizal fungi we have in tropical forest. Justine, I make it simple. This is the so-called endomycorrhizal network, which seems to be not so efficient in this respect. While with ectomycorrhizal network, that is the type of network we have in temperate forest, there is a kind of, when a species is there, it cultivates fungus that are useful to establish again the same species. And this story of indirect help, just by you feed a fungus and it will be helpful to the others, this kind of indirect help, I think, is shaping, that's the view of many ecologists, and it's part of our works to elaborate on that currently in Paris. It seems that it's the reason why there is so many different species in the tropics and so few species so 3 species in the temperate forest. I mean that here we face the fact that there is a kind of positive feedback from the soil in temperate forest, so that when a species is there, it becomes over-competitive. And there is, as a result, a few different species of trees in temperate forest, while this doesn't act so much in the tropical forest, and there is space for many more species, because the fact that one species is already there doesn't make the environment better for the same species to settle again. In other words, I think there is an indirect help that we have now to track, which has a strength that is different between type of forest, and that is probably stronger in temperate forest than in tropical forest. I don't know, Justine, how you see that.
No, I think it's a good point. And it's like, I think that we've been so hung up on common mycorrhizal networks and this idea that, sharing resources, when we still don't even know if, say, seedlings or trees even benefit if they are shared, it has distracted us from all the other kind of functional things that mycorrhizal fungi do. So as Marc-André said, just by virtue of being colonized by mycorrhizal fungi, and other trees will be colonized, there's a lot going on indirectly that has nothing to do with sharing resources or anything like that. And sometimes I think, it's sort of become a distraction. And because there's all these other things that mycorrhizal fungi and other fungi in the soil, I mean, we've been focusing on mycorrhizal fungi, but there's pathogens as well in terms of these feedbacks that Marc-André mentioned that are important in the system too. And so...
That's absolutely true.
Yeah,
You're right.
yeah.
I should have mentioned it.
And so I think this...
It's fascinating.
This larger view, like there's lots of interesting things going on. And the public has been really focused on this idea of, communication and all of that. But that's only a little slice of what we study and what we understand in terms of forests. And the other thing I wonder too about the communication angle is that when you step back, it's like, why do we have to make trees and fungi like people to care about them? I mean, what if we get to a point and say, well, actually, we don't think they do communicate through mycorrhizal networks or something? Like, does that make them less valuable? And the way that we treat the fungi in this WoodWideWeb is like, they're these little servants of trees, that they're moving stuff around and they're benevolent and they're there all to like take care of the tree. And that's not how it works. I guess I just question this idea of the value of personifying nature for us to care about it. And instead I would ask people to think about, can we not just let trees and fungi be different from us, and yet they still deserve our care and consideration and curiosity?
Yeah, true. And I think what you did, or what you three did, was to put a hard brake on this narrative to grow even more. Like the whole narrative we talked about the last 40 minutes. With in Germany, maybe to end this podcast, in Germany we have a saying that sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees. I don't know if you know that saying. But I think maybe what was happening here is that the narrative grew. No one was asking if that what we are citing is even true, is even recordable, and is even there are no. Is there a base for these claims truly? Or could it?
It just got away on us.
Exactly. It got a little bit out of hand. Also because of the public, because it's such a nice story to tell and everybody's loving each other, and now we can also love the trees and the trees are loving each other and the fungi.
Scientists have to also at some point make clear that they are responsible for that, because when you look at the book of Peter Wohllebens, for example, it was a wonderful success worldwide. For me, it's a poetic view of forest, and it's a good book, but not a scientific book. But it's a poetic book, and it's a nice book, and it was pushing back people to the trees and to the forest. So if I summarize, our problem now is to have scientists that stick to the data and try to have a storytelling that is appealing and offer something sexy. Let's use this word, sexy, to the public, that is based on facts. And our problem is that most of the time, the ones that are able to have sexiness in their writing are not the ones who have the data. And that's the problem, that we end up with a situation where scientists are not able to tell science to the public. When you see the problems of environmental change or health problem we have in our modern societies, it's extremely urgent that we think of making some scientists into good outreach, popular science specialists. We need that urgently, because we need not only to have nice stories, but relevant stories for us to act and understand the nature around us, which we didn't do over the last generations.
Yes, agree.
Yeah. Justine, Marc-André, thank you both very, very much for coming on this podcast and spreading some light on this important topic about the CMNs and what we really know and what we used to know, or what the narrative was, and how surprisingly it was for both of you, because you kind of, for at least for you, Justine, you started your whole life way based on this old, or in air quotes, old narrative, and now you're the one asking the relevant questions, to put it in nice words.
I guess it's kind of ironic. Yeah. Yes. Well,
it's ironic a little bit.
Thank you so much for having us on the show, Luca.
Thank you very much.
It was very nice to discuss that, and also thank you to Justine to have put the clock at the right time.
Yes. Guys, thank you very much for joining. To all the listeners, thank you very much for tuning in and joining in today. I hope we could inform you about this, and maybe you're not too disappointed that the trees are not loving each other, but they are communicating in some way, but we just need more data, more science, more experiments, more studies, and draw the right conclusions from them. And thank you very much for tuning in again, and have a nice day and stay healthy. Bye bye.